Chapter 73, Catharsis. Captain Snow watched Ashley and Jeff escape the police station, her long rifle held at her side. Reed hovered beside her. Croswell, Ross, and King had arrived late and tried entering the department invisibly, but had soon become enmeshed in the chaos of the lower floors and completely missed the action. Snow and Reed lost no time teasing them and complaining that they had allowed both Bergstrom and Dunkirk to escape. "It was insane in there," King argued. "It looked crowded," Snow answered, smiling. From his position, King, Croswell, and Ross discovered that they could see right into the homicide wing of the department. "But you saw what she did?" King asked. "That was great. Brilliant." Anna held up her rifle with the huge scope. "I see everything." "She was great," King laughed. "I don't know why you were ever worried." "I'm not worried," Anna rolled her eyes. "I mean, look at this. There's 5 of us and we couldn't protect them at all." "I don't know if I agree with that," Croswell said. "I just wanted her, both of them, to have a normal childhood. Why is that too much to ask?" Secretary Croswell put an arm around Anna's shoulder. "What's normal? When I was her age, Fox cut my arm off. It's definitely not normal." "It's not like you can change who they are," Ross said. "And I don't know why you'd want to. They're perfect. You did a great job." Snow laughed. "She did a great job. I was out here with you clowns." The soldiers cruised along overhead, laughing and joking as Ashley and Jeff made their way down the promenade, putting distance between themselves and the Angel City Police Department. Ashley's Journal, Monday, August 3rd, 2308. We got to the second backup cruiser after midnight. This one is bigger. There's plenty of room to stretch out, and 3 monitors to surf all the vid streams we want. We've been trying not to watch the news, but Dunkirk is everywhere. He escaped from the cops in an ambulance with another hostage. They lost him in a parking garage when he carjacked a rabbi. Dr. Martin Evander Dunkirk III, once a frontline battle surgeon turned landowner and patron of the arts, new to the ranks of infamous sociopaths. At least they didn't mention me, or Stanwood, or Von Kalt. That's one thing to be happy about. Ashley's Journal, Wednesday afternoon, August 5th, 2308. With over 100 victims discovered in the first days of the investigation, Dunkirk was the news of the summer. They're calling him the Calistan Canyon Killer. Over the last few days, the whole world has watched the footage of bodies being airlifted out of the ravine. It was ghastly. The commentary repeatedly pointed out that most of the victims were children. Time-lapse footage of the forest showed body after body streaming out of the canyon. The police got warrants for all the buildings owned by Mr. Dunkirk, and the horror show expanded to a dozen new locations. For years, he'd been abducting and murdering all kinds of people. Some were his tenants, others were complete strangers. They're saying he's a killer of opportunity. He wasn't particular about age or appearance. His victims ranged from children to the elderly. Where most other killers stick to a specific type, Dunkirk enjoyed variety. At its peak, the investigation included 127 corpses and 64 missing persons. They think his first victim may have been his mother at 13. Originally, her death had been ruled an accident, but now they're saying it was probably Martin. He's a genuine psycho. If he comes after me or my brother again, I'm going to kill him. I talked to Dr. Tay for a bit this afternoon. After Jeff and I picked up the second spare car Ross left us, I put the autopilot on a freeway loop and we took a nap. I woke up and he was sitting inside the transport with us. I didn't want to wake Jeff, so we just talked silently, just in our heads. I said it was nice to see him. He said he was glad to find us healthy and whole, and that it seemed like we were finally okay, now that the heat was off of us. I pointed out that our parents were still gone. Jeff was crying in his sleep earlier, but he didn't do it while Tay was here, and I didn't tell him about it. He said we don't need to worry now. I told him we'd heard that before. He said that the police were working hard to catch Mr. Dunkirk. He asked what we were up to, and I told him me and Jeff were on our way to a theme park, and that we plan to hit a new fair or amusement park every day, whether they catch us or not. So it was just as well they weren't looking anymore. I said even if we did go to Canada or Mexico, at least we would never go anywhere twice. Dr. Tay listened and then laughed really hard. He made me laugh, too. I didn't realize how long it had been since I laughed. Ashley's Journal, Wednesday, September 2nd, 2308. After a month on the road, Jeff and I agreed that, with summer ending, we have to do something different. All the other kids are going back to school. We can't pretend we're on vacation much longer. I've been thinking about this, and I've got a good idea about what to do. I Plotted a course for Angel City, and Jeff immediately asked if I thought going back home was a bright idea. He said I was breaking our number one rule. I told him we were going somewhere neither of us had ever been before. At a truck stop, I bought an electric razor and made him help me shave my head. Later that day, we arrived at Flying Dragon's Martial Arts Academy and presented ourselves for check-in at the front desk. A bit of digital preparation on Jeff's part made the paperwork a breeze. He used the Micronics to fill out the applications and forward our transcripts from Rivendell before we got there. Once the tuition charges cleared, there was nothing to worry about. We've been using our parents' account ever since Ross disappeared. We were safe for a whole week before they caught up with us at the campground. I've been thinking about that. When I bought the hoverboard, it wasn't the transaction that brought the agents. If it had been the Kodak, it would have been mall cops that caught me. So the charges cleared. After that, who cares? I'll fight them when they get here. Also, because of our short notice registration and late arrival, Ashton and Jeffrey would be rooming together, despite their age difference. Which is what we wanted anyhow. It'll be a lot easier to maintain my disguise as a boy this way. I'm going to learn everything they teach here, the same way I did with ballet. Someday I'm going to see Martin Dunkirk again. He's been running circles around the cops. Sooner or later he's going to come after me. It's just a matter of time. Next time, I will be ready. Epilogue. Here There Be Dragons. A week after the horrors of Calistan Way, a pair of uniformed patrolmen wandered through the Oceanside Park where Bobby slept. Their morning duties largely consisted of chasing away the neighborhood indigents, but a homeless child called for more immediate intervention. The social services team was called out, and Bobby was transported back to a local holding station. It didn't take long to identify the silent child and deliver him to his new home. District 13, the Angel City Orphanage and Juvenile Detention Facility. The district maintained prenatal care for infants, school for orphaned students, and a massive wing for the criminally inclined delinquents of Angel City. Bobby hadn't uttered a word since his arrival. Silent amidst a teeming sea of children, he wandered the district, seeking hidden, quiet, out-of-the-way places where he might gaze upon his gleaming treasure of brass, copper, and lead. Within a few days, Bobby discovered an abandoned wing of the orphanage. Wandering, he noted the strong scent of death and rot. He followed his nose and soon encountered a cruelly deformed guard. The man was a hulking brute, and his eyes glittered with malicious intent. Bobby approached with an honest, open expression and showed the man his bullets. The monster smiled and led Bobby through several locked doors to a concealed section of the district. The reek of death was overpowering. They passed through a blood-stained dorm, beds gone black with gore. That was when Bobby first began to hear the cries. They entered another dorm, filled with children, all chained to their beds. Several had been beaten or were the victims of hideous disfigurements. Gruesome scars adorned their young bodies, holes in the flesh where internal organs had been removed, stitched closed with stiff black thread. Those not chained to the beds were largely amputees. Misery, pain, and torment enveloped them. Bobby realized that he once again stood with death. He found that he didn't mind the stench or their suffering. In fact, he rather relished it. The pain and suffering of others made him acutely aware of his own excellent health, his own good fortune. He felt death was a wise and generous friend, the only friend he needed. He felt honored to be so warmly wrapped in its embrace. It was after Thanksgiving and before Christmas that Morgenstern got a line on their former associate, Mr. Dunkirk. He was in Phoenix. The battle-scarred giant packed provisions for the trip and double-checked his route to the desert. The grizzled veteran had once worked as a surgical assistant to then Dr. Dunkirk. He was now employed aboard the Angel City Orphanage Juvenile Detention Facility as its coroner. It wasn't everything he'd hoped for in life, but it did provide an unending feast of delicious victims. Franklin Gustav Morgenstern had accepted his appetites early in life. Several of his co-conspirators aboard the floating orphanage were intrigued by the proposal of meeting the infamous Dunkirk. They wished him safe travels and hoped he returned soon. Before Morgenstern set off, he stopped by Bobby's room to let him know that he might have a surprise for him in a couple of days. The light reflecting off Bobby's necklace of brass shells made the serial killer smile. Bobby asked Morgenstern to reaffirm his pledge that once they found his father, they'd go after the person responsible, the one who'd betrayed him and informed the police. Morgenstern nodded. He was fascinated by what he'd heard of Miss Ashley Fox. She sounded like marvelous sport, and he was looking forward to that hunt. He didn't inform Dr. Bergstrom, however. Dr. Bergstrom didn't know what to make of Bobby. After a brief conversation, establishing that the boy had indeed grown up just a few doors from the Fox family, Cedric kept him at a distance. Bobby was pleasant enough, and everyone else he met seemed enamored of him, another effect Bergstrom couldn't quite wrap his head around. He was clearly Dunkirk's son, but he had some sort of internal power of his own. He smelled and sounded like the Micronics, but something was wildly off. The patterns and commands were skewed. Cedric was content to refrain from action until he knew what he was dealing with. The Micronics had adapted after his last encounter with it, and Ashley had taken the counterfeit device from that fool Von Kalt. He feared the other shoe had yet to drop. He intended to be anywhere but beneath it when it finally did come down. 6 months after he died, Dr. Andrew Fox was awakened by a jolt of electricity. He sat up, his head and shoulders breaking the surface of the tank. The sensation of air on his skin and a second shock of electricity contracted the muscles of his midsection, causing him to exhale the breathable fluid from his lungs and take his first breath of recycled laboratory oxygen. A third shock and he threw himself from the tank, a puddle of blue syrup spreading beneath him. He vomited and coughed up the blue-tinged fluids. Dr. Fox caught his breath and stood. He wiped the thick syrup from his limbs and reached out to a nearby stack of towels. In a few minutes he was mostly dry, if stained a faint blueberry. He ignored the puddle he left. The bots would get to it soon enough. Wrapped in towels, he walked from the tank, passing another with a similar, recently cleansed but not fully faded stain on the floor. Fox entered the dressing room and opened his locker. The clothes he'd requested were there, simple linen pants, a long-sleeved shirt, and a pair of casual loafers. He'd grown quite fond of the prison outfit. It was rather comfortable. He'd also noticed the chill in the air, and as this was his locker, he ignored the desert apparel and opted for something warmer. Fox exited the locker room in jeans, boots, and a heavy shirt. He'd recognized the surroundings already. The snow-covered landscape outside the frosted windows confirmed his suspicions. Apparently Stanwood never made it down to Chile to visit Wyndham. In a moment of weakness, Fox had told Stanwood everything. He'd given up the testing site on the Isle of Man, the fabrication site near his wife's childhood home in Czechoslovakia, and the McMurdo Annex, where he found himself at the moment. He hadn't lied. He'd just set out some diversions for his old friend. He'd have to give him some version of the truth, just to move things along, or he'd probably still be out there in the desert. He heard voices from somewhere nearby. Fox continued down the hallway and entered the common area. The room went silent as he entered. He saw the faces of his friends. Ross, Croswell, King, Reed, Wolfe, and Beckett. Dr. Tay was there, with both Anastasias. The original looked pissed, but he'd come to expect that. Even Sabor and some of Dr. Tay's bots were present. Fox took a seat on one of the empty couches and smiled. "So, how are the kids?" Bonus Chapter 1, Blue Goo, August 29th, 2273, 35 years ago. The first day of 8th grade and half the class stood huddled around Wendell Meyer, seated on an industrial table in the science laboratory. His pants were pushed up to his thigh, his ruined knee exposed for all. Wendell helped himself to a handful of the blue goo from the 10-gallon tub next to his leg. He applied it to the mangled joint. Near the beginning of the previous school year, almost a year to the day, he'd been trapped in the pool's hydraulic cover, and the mechanical joint had mutilated his knee. Wendell had spent the bulk of the school year in bed, taking all his classes in virtual. He'd had 4 surgeries, and the last set of pins had just come out a week ago. The doctors talked about replacing the joint altogether, but Wendell's mother had objected. Wendell Meyer and Andrew Fox had been close friends that year. After the accident, Andrew dedicated all his spare time and a significant amount of his family fortune in creating and developing the goo. "It itches," Wendell said, as his skin devoured the blue-tinted mixture. "Ouch!" The knee swelled under the blue coating. "Ah!" Wendell cried. He lay back on the table, his face knotted into a scream he didn't dare utter at full volume for fear of bringing a teacher. The boys watched as the knee repaired itself. A thick sweat popped out on Wendell's face. The joint began to make strange cracking and rending sounds. Wendell gulped air in tortured gasps. A few seconds later, the knee began to shrink, the blue tint staining the skin and bubbling from his pores. Within 2 minutes, Wendell's knee was back to its natural size, albeit a bit skinnier than the other, coated in a thick blue wrapping. The goo had become a kind of splint, a rubber bandage, holding the bones, tendons, and ligaments in place. Wendell swung his leg. It works. He gestured for Jim Croswell to pass over his crutches. Jim reached out and picked them up, but didn't hand them over. Fine. Wendell smiled and hopped down from the table. He stood on his own 2 feet for the first time since the accident. Smiling, he lifted and flexed the shattered knee. He walked a few steps, staring at the blue-wrapped joint, and then burst running from the room, screaming wildly. Jim carried the crutches to a corner and leaned them up against the wall. "Who else wants to try?" Andrew asked. At first the kids were skeptical. Andrew opened a drawer full of dissection tools. "Step right up," he said, and removed a tray of scalpels from the drawer. "It can heal anything?" Stephen asked. "It's healed everything I've tried so far," Andrew answered. "Ha! What have you tried?" Andrew smiled. He held up his left arm and rolled up the sleeve of his school button-down. His arm was covered with telltale blue rubber scars. Most of the kids looked nervous, staying well away from the surgical blades. "I'll go first then," Andrew said, reaching out for a knife. He brought it down across the back of his left arm, opening a gash between his wrist and elbow, spilling blood onto the countertop. Andrew clenched his teeth and applied a smooth coating of the blue goo. He held out his arm for the others to watch. Almost as if it were reversing the damage done by the blade, the goo sealed the gash. As it worked itself out of the cut, it formed a new coating, and a few seconds later, Andrew's arm was good as new. Wendell returned to the lab at full speed, catching himself in the doorframe. "Thanks, Andrew. You're the best. They said I was never going to walk again." Wendell ran off again at full speed, his footsteps and jubilant cries trailing down the hallway. Andrew smiled, thrilled with Wendell's recovery. "How does it work?" Croswell asked. "Supercharged polysynthetic nanostem cells. Once exposed to living tissue, they work backwards to regenerate any damaged or missing cells." "Seems to work pretty good so far," Andrew said. Andrew Fox and Jim Croswell had been friends since early childhood. Their fathers often worked together on various government projects. Andrew and Jimmy saw a lot of each other growing up. They'd always been great friends. Both Croswell and Fox were considered to be at the top among their peers, and neither of them took any crap from Stanwood, who bullied everyone else. Croswell was far more athletic than Fox, so the mantle of leadership fell to him. "What else did you try?" Stanwood asked, nodding to Fox's arm. Joe Stanwood, in his own weird way, had never fit in with anyone. Most of the boys were scared shitless of him. Andy and Jim seemed able to tolerate him. It seemed to the other kids that perhaps Fox and Croswell were unaware of how spectacularly creepy Joe actually was. It was in his mannerisms, the way he talked and used his hands. He was, in a word, malevolent. Andrew removed his shirt. His body was covered with blue rubber strips and scars. There was almost no open skin for more than a few inches. "Holy shit," Croswell said. "I feel 100% fine. It activates the RNA to work overtime, fixing whatever's out of whack." Stanwood looked into Andrew's eyes, taunting him. "You don't seem fine." Andrew began to unbuckle his pants, but several objections and declarations of trust stopped him. "And it gets absorbed through the skin like that?" Stanwood asked. "You saw it. So is it better for cuts or broken fingers?" Stanwood inquired. "I think either or," Andrew replied. "Could it grow back a whole arm or a leg?" Joe asked. "I don't know, but I bet it can reattach them." "No way," Stanwood answered. "Brain injuries? How do you get it in there?" "Shit, maybe it can fix you, Joe," Croswell said. Several of the other kids laughed. "Fox is going to be a millionaire. I bet it'll fix anything," Stephen volunteered. "It fixed Wendell's leg," Tom Beckett said. "He's happy as shit." Andrew realized he didn't have to answer Stanwood's objections. The other boys were making his arguments for him. They had witnessed the power of the goo. Joe Stanwood raised his hands, smiling. The guys grew quiet. "Can it reattach someone's head?" Stanwood asked. "I don't know, but I'd love to try," Fox answered. The boys heard the challenge and responded with an "Ooh." "Don't cut anyone's head off, seriously," Stanwood replied. "I think it could maybe regrow a finger or something, but it would be expensive," Andrew said. "I don't think I could do it with this. We need a thicker composition. It'd take longer." "How much did it cost to make this?" Croswell asked. "Close to $17 million, Andrew said in a low voice. "Holy shit," Beckett said. "I said close to," Andrew countered. "I think you get holy shit at 20. But the current medical science can already reattach limbs for a lot less, Stanwood pointed out. And we have lots of ways to accelerate the healing process, so this is kind of redundant. It's a little too expensive for the common people. All you did was waste a bunch of money. An hour later, after more than 70 healed scrapes, cuts, abrasions, lacerations, fractures, burns, and contusions, they had exhausted their creativity and courage. They had reached a place where the pain endured outweighed the novelty of having the tissue magically repaired. Andrew took notes while the boys played. He took a sample of blood from each volunteer, usually from whatever instrument of violence used to create the tissue damage, never allowing any blade to be used twice. He bagged the tools of destruction and logged each into his notebook, along with the damage done and how long it took the goo to repair the wound. With one boy, Jesse Parker, total repair took an agonizing 47 seconds. But Jesse's wound had been rather severe. They'd attacked his leg with an electric hedge clipper. Then they applied the goo and stopped the femoral artery before dumping Jesse's entire blood supply on the laboratory floor. The boys laughed and joked as they replaced chunks of meat from his ruined thigh. A minute later, Jesse's leg was good as new, minus the damage to his school pants. Croswell had wanted to see how hard the other boys could punch him. He'd asked each of them to give it all they had. He dared them to outdo each other in a single strike. After taking a haymaker from everyone in the room, Tom got creative and broke a glass beaker over Jim's head. His face looked like hamburger. The boys stuck a straw in his mouth and coated his entire face in the goo. Andrew estimated it cost almost $100,000 to wrap Jim's face, but they had plenty left. Bored, they began to discuss grievous, mortal wounds. Andrew tried to dissuade them. Gabriel joked about cutting Sandoval's throat, who happened to not be present, and challenged Andrew to save him before he died. Andrew countered that he'd never liked Enrique and wouldn't be inclined to help him no matter what. That would leave Gabe on the hook for murder. Several boys laughed, and after the hedge clippers, no one did anything excessively stupid. Andrew suggested it was time to lock the goo up. Croswell peeled the rubber from his eyes. "I want to try something bigger." "Something bigger like what?" Andrew asked. "I want you to cut my arm off," Jim said. "You're fucking crazy," Stanwood said. "No, I'm not," he replied to Joe. Croswell looked over to Andrew. "I want you to cut my arm off." "Stay here." Andrew left the room. Half a dozen boys trailed after him. Croswell, Stanwood, and several others remained behind. "Seriously, Joe, you should try it. It really works," Croswell said. "Forget that," Stanwood replied. "You don't know what the side effects are. Maybe someday you wake up and who knows? It might kill you a month from now." "Yeah, well, Fox'll die first." Andrew walked to the locked glass trophy case in the grand entrance hall of the academy. He picked up a nearby chair and used it to knock the glass out. The surrounding boys watched as he reached into the case and removed the long samurai sword, the katana, from the daisho, the set of 2 swords. The set had been awarded to the Rivendell Kendo team from the Yagyu Sword School of Japan. Andrew's great-grandfather had competed in the tournament that had claimed the glorious trophy. Now the young man had pilfered his ancestor's trophy case for an afternoon of raucous and juvenile amusement. Andrew argued the points and counterpoints in his mind. What he was doing was contributing to science. He needed volunteers, and to get them, he needed an extraordinary claim, an outrageous claim, a bit of theater. He had broken the glass in a calculated gesture. He needed to put an end to the experimentation while they still had a ton of goo. He needed to get caught, so the discovery could be exposed, with a number of witnesses. On the way back to the lab, the boys joked about what they would do with such magical power. Several confirmed beatings they intended to dole out, and then supply the recipient with a bit of blue goo to heal them right up. The lists of rivals were long, and the actions to be taken against them were intricate, cunning, and cruel. Once Andrew and the others returned with the sword, the boys who'd waited behind fell silent. Andrew Fox looked Jim Croswell in the eyes. He held up the sword and prepared to take it out of its sheath. Jim stepped close to the tub and held his arm out over it. Andrew stepped back and the other boys cleared out, leaving him enough room to draw and swing the sword. Andrew gestured to Stephen and Jesse, standing opposite Croswell. "Grab his arm," he said. The boys looked from Andrew to James, who nodded. They reached out to his hand. "When I hit it, you have to take it right down into the goo, then right back up to his arm," Andrew instructed. "Goo, we should call it glue," Stephen said. "Shouldn't we put some on his arm too?" Jesse asked. "Yeah, Beckett, Andrew pointed with the sword, stand here next to the tub. When I slash through the arm, Stephen and Joe are going to be holding it. Wait for the sword to go through, and then put your hands in the tub. As they bring the forearm to the tub, I want you to take that handful of goo up to Jimmy's stump. Got it? Several kids laughed, but Tom nodded. Andrew drew the sword from its sheath. I wonder if he'll scream, someone in the back said. Andrew looked James in the eye, and without waiting for a count of 3, or a ready, set, go, Fox raised the sword and slashed through Croswell's upper arm. The sword severed the boy's humerus with little more resistance than if it were slicing through smoke. Andrew held the sword still and low after the cut. James didn't scream. He didn't gasp. He didn't make a sound. Tom reached into the tub, grabbing a handful of the goo. Stephen and Jesse brought Jim's forearm and elbow down into the tub, passing Tom on his way up to the open stump. As Tom applied the goo, an excited pulse of blood sprayed into the room. Jesse and Stephen dunked the detached stump and reattached it to Jimmy's remaining upper arm. The room was quiet, except for the sound of the blue and red drops hitting the floor. The goo caused the skin to swell and knit together where it had separated. Blood and blue syrup bubbled from the bicep. As the excess ran off, the remainder of the goo grew darker, harder, rubbery, and thick. James smiled. He took a deep breath and wiggled the fingers of his left hand. Jesse and Stephen felt the arm come alive under their grasp. It grabbed and shook them. It had taken less than 30 seconds. Croswell pulled the limb away and flexed it. Excess goo and plasma burst from the seam, the scar where the limb had been severed. James punched his palm, and then turned and slammed his hand through a wood panel cabinet, laughing. Withdrawing the fist, he saw he'd damaged it anew. He laughed as he lathered the splintered fingers with Dr. Fox's super blue healing goo. During that first week of 8th grade, all the boys involved in the incident with the goo found themselves assembled in a large conference room, seated with their parents and their parents' lawyers. Professor Cotton recited his discovery of the scene in the laboratory. The adults got the whole story, from Andrew's inspiration by Wendell's accident to Jim's courageous determination in the name of scientific progress. The patent filed in Andrew's name resulted in a massive windfall. In the final settlement, all the kids who participated in the blue goo experiment received a king's ransom. Joe Stanwood, who hadn't participated, got nothing. Bonus Chapter 2, Centaur Cyber Tanks. December 31st, 2299, 8.5 years earlier. Another night on the office couch. It was just after 6 when Fox woke. Being the dead of winter and the last day of the year, the sun still had not yet lit the horizon. Fox had a couple hours before the generals arrived. He knew the project waiting outside his office, the 10,000 cyber tanks, would win the war. It was the approaching footsteps that had awakened him. Someone was coming. Dr. Fox sat up in the darkness and rubbed his face. Visitors plural. There were at least 2 of them. Fox switched on the light. A moment later came the knock at his door. Yes, come in. Chief Operator Chris Matthews and Special Agent Tasha Vangen entered. The doctor smiled. So this is it, huh? The big day? Matthews nodded. We're all ready, sir. Third Gate citizen Chris Matthews was one of those gung-ho patriots that rarely looked before he leaped. Fox didn't trust him to think for himself, but if you gave him an order, he'd die before giving up. You couldn't have everything in a project manager, and Matthews was better than most. He was honest and loyal, and those were qualities valuable beyond measure. We've got 36 units spooled up and another 24 taking on fluids and ammunition, Matthews reported. Special Agent Vangen looked troubled. Tasha was special for several reasons, the least of which being her status as an international dignitary on loan from Sweden. By default, the clear-headed young woman often found herself elected to go up against the party-line Matthews. She was the most socially well-adjusted scientist Fox had met in years, sharp as a neutron laser, cool under pressure, and a pleasure to work with. Tasha was also dating Andrew's younger brother, Jeffrey. They were secretly engaged and waiting for the project to be officially over before they said anything. From the look on Tasha's face, it was clear something had gone sideways. Fox knew, at this late stage of the game, it's just the way it went sometimes. Major General Crothers and his staff had arrived at the nearby observation station a day earlier. 10 miles north of the border, they reviewed intelligence data, watching and fast forward as the enemy flooded into Tijuana over the last month. Over 2 million strong, the Christian socialists intended to take San Diego with the force of sheer numbers alone. The tension in the room was palpable. The intelligence officers were panicked, but not about the enemy's numbers. They couldn't identify any weapons. The enemy had arrived empty-handed. The socialists always marched with artillery. There was no other way they could cross the border en masse without some method of detonating the mines. The presence of cannon had always been the justification for the Republic's overwhelming response. It would be difficult for the talking heads in Washington to explain the dropping of bulk munitions on a group of civilians. The officers continued to scramble, but all they could find were light arms, handguns, and rifles. The People's Army of Christ the Redeemer hadn't brought a single cannon. Usually they had an overwhelming amount of artillery, but today they had none. Cold California sunlight hit the few remaining sandstone and glass structures. Ground-bound buildings and homes that could not be moved reflected a dull, empty sky. Until as little as a month ago, the sky was filled with hovering structures, but now San Diego stood empty, evacuated. Only freeway cables remained, hanging flat and lifeless. All the hover-tech high-rises had flown away, north to Angel City and Santa Barbara, or northeast to Palm Springs and Phoenix. Washington did not want the relocations to become permanent, even if the destruction of the ground-based structures in San Diego proved unavoidable. The concept of surrendering San Diego was unacceptable. The Republic would rather see the remainder of the city razed than let it fall into enemy hands. Despite the fact that the enemy was armed with little more than handguns and ethanol-driven vehicles, once the Christians marched in, the consensus in Washington would be to dump bulk munitions, destroying the South American People's Army of Christ the Redeemer, as well as the cities of San Diego and Tijuana. General Crothers advocated dropping the big one and being done with it. His superiors strongly disagreed, arguing that the radioactive fallout would poison the entire coastline. General Crothers didn't much care for California, but his superiors made themselves clear that even a 3-day carpet bombing campaign was preferable to a nuclear event on national soil. The general had been hearing good things about the cyber tank project, and he was excited about its delivery in just a few hours. Today was New Year's Eve, and if the intelligence estimates were correct, the Socialist People's Army would be amassing at the border by sunset, crosses, guns, and flags held high, prayers on their lips. It was always the same. The faithful came and died by the thousands, and San Diego would succumb to its bloody fate as so many smaller cities already had. The Socialists would not retreat, and another rotting cavity would be created on the Republic's southern border. The general longed to be able to stop them without destroying 100 stories of steel and glass. He held no concern for human life. In fact, San Diego was already lost. No one had stayed. No one was going back anytime soon. The only thing left was to punish the enemy for their forward momentum. That was enough for him. That was all he needed to feel victorious. The cyber tanks were his best hope for that victory. 200 miles north and 70 miles west of the coast, a 12-layer military testing facility hovered above the ocean. The unit's anti-gravity drives maintained a comfortable 10,000 feet above the water, nothing but ocean and sky in every direction as far as the eye could see. 3 prowlers circled the facility at a 10-mile radius. Their weapon systems were always hot, ready to fire on any errant vehicles that might enter their perimeter. Each layer of the facility was composed of several floors, with an array of hover disks working in unison to maintain equilibrium. The 12 levels were arranged in a stacked formation, several miles square. Each deck featured a unique environment: desert, forest, swampland. The levels grew in square footage as one went upward. The top level stretched 10 miles square and featured a rich urban environment, several blocks of 7 to 10-story buildings. The tests at this facility employed live ammunition, and many areas had been reduced to heaps of rubble and twisted steel, while others were clearly in a state of construction, being rebuilt for the umpteenth time. In the east, the sun touched the distant horizon. The early ocean air felt clean and crisp against the doctor's face. For the past week, he'd been in a state of panic. Finally, all the last-minute details were complete, and the project was ready for delivery. The transport landed on the upper receiving dock, and the personnel disembarked. Major General Crothers, followed by his colleagues, was glowing with excitement. After brief introductions, Dr. Fox led the gentlemen to the storage hangar. The cyber tank sat connected to various cables, power and fluids snaking along the floor to ports and pumps. The hangar smelled of industrial chemicals, gun oil, and fuel. The tanks themselves were dark masses of armor plate, with wicked-looking tracks and munitions delivery systems protruding from several angles. Extra ammo drums were mounted on the rear fenders. Belt-fed 12-barrel machine guns were mounted to the front. Running perfectly, they glided over rough and rocky ground smoother than ice on glass. 4 diesel engines powered by the heavy-duty treads, top speed 120 kilometers an hour. Dr. Fox led the inspection team up to one of the forward units. He pointed out the shielded sensor array, the triple redundant communications drives, overlapping armor plates, and other external features before touching on the internal functions of the unit. Colonel Thompson, standing next to General Crothers, raised his hand. Are these units autonomous, or do they require rear echelon support? Both and neither. They house organic operators, wired to the control systems, and they also maintain constant communication with command and control agents here at the facility. You're saying there's people in there? A soldier? An operator? An experienced soldier. Battle-tested veterans. They have some of the best reaction times we've ever seen. But that isn't legal, the colonel interrupted. General Crothers rolled his eyes. Thompson, do you want to be part of this unit, or can I just transfer your ass back to Washington? Sir, it's just... We're trying to win a war here, Colonel. Sir, direct weapon-to-brain wiring systems have been illegal for more than 70 years. The political ramifications could be, it's illegal for citizens, Thompson. We can't be expected to fight a war with the fuckos back in Washington making all the rules. Crothers turned back to Fox. Please continue, Doctor. Later that afternoon, as he was escorted from the facility, Dr. Fox had an awful feeling about the impending skirmish. He'd tried to impress upon the general and his staff that the biotanks should never be taken above level 6 when facing civilians. The higher levels were reserved for more advanced enemies. The Christian Socialists could hardly be called organized. Their defense and offense were one and the same. A human wave of men, women, and children, healthy and young, old and sick. Their attack came in the form of a protest march. They all came. Fox felt sick to his stomach knowing that Crothers and his staff would be commanding the base side operators. He knew that Matthews and his team weren't likely to play along. Unfortunately, they were no longer under his jurisdiction. The operators were contracted as part of the project deliverables and now accountable to the military authorities responsible for the project. Dr. Fox suspected Crothers intended to take the mechanized war machines to their highest level, 10, reserved for training only, one mech against another. At that level, the machines would drive over infants, relishing in the squishy sounds from beneath their treads. Fox was suddenly awash in fear, regret, and shame. He contemplated demanding the pilot turn the vehicle around, but didn't. He knew the captain would not change the flight path. If he went back and opposed Crothers now, it would be career suicide. They would call that treason. Now there was little Fox could do besides get himself shot. A ripple went through the crowd. It was time. The barbecues were hastily put out, and the caravans prepared to press north. Small arms were given a quick field cleaning and oiled. Ammunition was passed around and loaded in clips. Children and old folks packed into cars, alongside sandbags and ammunition crates. The faithful fell silent for a final blessing. They crossed themselves, kissed their rosaries, and plastic glow-in-the-dark statues of Jesus, which were passed around and placed on the dashboards of the cars. They waited while the audio up front was sorted out, excusing the whispered joke or interruption to pass the tequila bottle. Father Ricardo raised the microphone. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He made the sign of the cross over the crowd, holding a crucifix in his hand, which he kissed. The people made the sign of the cross, each in their own way, in their own time. Brothers and sisters, we are gathered here this evening to celebrate freedom and community in the Lord. This is the birth of a new age. Tomorrow the sun will rise on another city, freed from greed and tyranny. Once these were our lands, but 500 years ago the liars and hypocrites from across the sea came and stole our birthrights. Yes, I say hypocrites, though many profess to be members of the faith. They were once people of the Lord, but they have fallen. For the Lord says that one cannot serve two masters, and they are the servants of gold. They erect borders and issue citizenship cards of different status. That is not truth. For are we not all children of the one true God? What is a citizen? It's just a word, an idea that is used to separate the children of God, used to put one person's worth above another's. We are not different. American or Mexican, European or Asian, African, Colombian or Canadian. We are all children of the Lord, so we must be brothers and sisters. Show me a border in the earth. It does not exist. The Lord did not create borders. He created mountains and rivers and oceans, which some men miscall borders, but they are only mountains, rivers, and oceans. We serve the truth, for only the truth can set you free. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Serve the poorest among you, so that he may know the Lord's tender loving care. When we, the people of the Word, arrived here in this place, our Lord struck the enemy with fear and made him take flight. He does not stand and face us. He does not want to hear the word of God. He knows we come in the name of justice, liberty, and equality. There is not made the missile that can kill an ideal. Our enemy once worshipped these same ideals, and they know how powerful they are. They have grown corrupt and criminal in their twilight years. The Lord has raised us up and put us in this place, that we might spread his word among them. Our Heavenly Father has done his part. He has shown us the road we must travel. It is up to us to follow it. Let us bring the light to those who are trapped, lost in the darkness. Lord, though the way before us be full of peril, give us courage to press forward and return to these our ancestral lands. I bless you in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. The blessing over, celebratory beers were cracked and the People's Army fired up competing mariachi music from rival sound systems. In the failing light, torches, flashlights, and vehicle-mounted floodlights burst to life. The engines of the faithful were put into low gear, and the army surged forward, crossing the imaginary border from Mexico into the United States, with high-pitched screams and bursts of automatic gunfire punctuating the auspicious nature of the event. Shaped like an elbow, the coastline of San Diego is dotted with hills, climbing from and returning to the Pacific Ocean. The People's Army had a 12-mile march to the center of the downtown area. The first few miles were littered with mines, a cratered barren stretch of barbed wire, collapsed trenches, and half-buried corpses. The Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency had declared the land a free fire zone decades ago. Both sides fired mortars into it any time someone tried to cross. The Christian Communist Army made slow progress as everything in their path was consumed. Stretches of barbed wire were rolled up and secured to vehicles. Metal barricades were cut with high-powered torches and used like railroad ties to repair the path ahead. From the sandbag backs of rolling pickup trucks, the People's Army fired homemade mortars across the no-man's land, detonating the waiting mines and blowing holes in the larger stretches of barbed wire. The battle had just begun, but already the city had given up for dead. Only the inevitable desiccation of the Metropolitan Corps remained, the smashing of street-level windows and burning of storefronts. San Diego had no water or power flowing through her veins. No foodstuffs were delivered to her markets. Not one floating residence or business structure adorned her skyline. Anything that could be carried out during the evacuations had been taken long ago. The Marines had built their barricades on the southern wall of the city. Teams of sharpshooters occupied every room with a view, and platoons held strategic locations along every major route. But all combined, they numbered under 20,000. The People's Army had swollen to several million strong. The Marines were required to stop the enemy at all costs, but against millions, they knew they could hardly even slow them down. Before long, the remaining soldiers heard the first of the proximity mines go off. The Christians ran zombie vehicles into the minefields at high speed. The mines were set to be triggered by foot traffic so a single vehicle could take out several, providing it didn't crash into a collapsed tunnel, crater, or any of the other dozens of likewise destroyed remains of its ancestors. The Marines heard the mines begin, and the call went out over the radio for all soldiers to retreat to Bravo positions, as airstrikes were expected to begin any minute. The young soldiers retreated and waited, but the airstrikes never came. At the Centaur facility, General Crothers argued with the high command about the launch orders. He wanted to activate half the arsenal, but couldn't get Washington to commit that level of support. Besides, there were only 24 control stations and 12 operators, restricting the initial run to only 12 units, launched one at a time. The general's demand to allow the tanks to run unsupervised had ended the debate. Crothers roundly cursed Washington as a bunch of rear-echelon cowards and only managed to get 7 tanks off the ground. The first cyber tank unit crashed into the no-man's land opposite the soldiers of Christ. The people stopped in their advance and regarded the impact site. They had watched it come whistling in, and expected a massive explosion. The impact was immense. Huge clouds of dirt and debris billowed upward, but there was no explosion. Several shots were fired at the vehicle, the bullets streaming away as they bounced or tumbled from the armored surface. The unit offered no response. Despite their fear of the blackish metallic vehicle, the men crept forward. It took several minutes for the ragtag band of resistance fighters to surround it, but eventually they did. They inspected its government-assigned markings, meaningless combinations of letters and numbers. One drunken soldier leaned up close against a tinted window. "Oi, hay un tipo aquí." "Hey, there's a guy in here." He looked over his shoulder to his comrades. "Y sus ojos son de oro." And his eyes are golden. The crowd jumped back as the engines inside the tank ignited. Before they could move away, barrels rose from the machine's hide, and it lurched forward. The courageous men closest to it were crushed under the sharp treads. Hundreds were mowed down by the fire-belching machine guns, blasting hot shrapnel into the soldiers of Christ. The next two units landed closer to the northern side of the border and had to drive forward to meet the enemy. The following four came to earth behind the southern border, chewing up God's people from behind. There was no escape, there was no mercy, and by dawn there was no more conflict in San Diego. A shootout in the operations lab prevented more than 7 launches. When ordered to set the tanks to level 10, lead operator Matthews objected and found himself in a heated argument with the soldiers. One of them accused him of being a traitor and struck him. Matthews drew his weapon and 2 soldiers shot him a dozen times. Matthews' comrades, including Jeffrey Fox, drew their weapons and had themselves a Wild West shootout with the soldiers right there in the control room. Wielding small arms, the operators shot at the soldiers who, sporting assault rifles, opened fire on everything, killing the operators, each other, and utterly destroying the machinery. The generals, watching the satellite feeds in the officers' command center, and failed to either prevent the massacre or be caught up in it, and to be fair, they didn't much care. The tanks were free to destroy everything that moved along the forward battle area, a job they executed with ruthless and brutal efficiency. One young operator, who'd stepped out to use the washroom, managed to escape. Tasha hijacked a maintenance vehicle and slipped from the facility with a shipping convoy. The patrols overhead ignored her, distracted by the news from the research station. By the time the generals realized a possible witness was at large, Tasha had long since vanished. Reading about the political fallout, Ashley had recognized her photo. She remembered the chaos that followed her father's delivery of the tanks. The war in San Diego was over, but the method used to accomplish the victory had left the Republic sick to its stomach. Much of the blame had fallen on Fox's shoulders for designing the tanks. He was called a monster and a war criminal. He was accused of being some hideous mixture of Hitler, Stalin, Genghis Khan, and John Robert Oppenheimer. The in-house security video of the control room shootout was leaked to the press, and the truth of the soldiers' actions, as well as the loss of Andrew's brother Jeffrey, silenced the interest in seeing Dr. Fox take the fall for the debacle. Ashley had read, in the library, that a short time later, a new task had been presented to her father, Project Epsilon.